He even said that eventually the European nations would all unite into a union, evidently including Germany and her then former enemies. He predicted the European Union, which is not a technology prediction, it's a human, societal, political prediction. And you got to give him credit for that. He did miss on some things. He didn't think airplanes would come about until near the end of the 20th century, when in fact it was only going to be 3 more years before the Wright brothers took a flight at Kitty Hawk, and planes were quite prominent by World War I. He also didn't think submarines would ever amount to anything, and I have to say he was way off on that one. But this is the kind of thing that it's easy to pick holes in a fella's predictions. He really did quite well when you think about it back in 1901, and people took him seriously. He talked a lot about, for example, radiation. Everybody understood a few things about radiation back then. They didn't understand it really well, but they understood that radium, for example, was constantly emitting a very low level of energy, and that it would gradually decay over time. And Wells wrote a paper, a novel, in which he talked about radioactive explosions. And the way Wells envisioned the explosions happening was very, very different. It was very sort of amateur. He pictured a device that would slowly vacuum up all the radiation from radium and other things, just sort of constantly pull it in, and then let it all out at once. But the basic idea of a very, very large explosion happening as a result of nuclear radioactivity, he wasn't wrong about that. And again, he was 10 years early in terms of what scientists were ready to find and discover. But one of those scientists, Leo Szilard, read that novel, and he said in his memoirs that it was very influential upon his thought, and he was one of the key physicists who went on to help invent the nuclear chain reaction that led to the atomic bomb and everything we know about atomic power. So here's an example of how writing can really affect the alleged real world. Really, is there a difference, right? Wells is talking about what's possible. And how can you do something before you've thought of it, right? And if you think of it first in a novel that's fiction, well, that's great, that's fine, but who's to say that's not going to happen just because it's impossible today, right? He brought up that kind of an impact on the real world. And of course, if you don't know the story of the War of the Worlds, that's another area where there's obviously an impact on real life. The story of the War of the Worlds. He wrote the novel back around the turn of the century, and it made, it was a bestseller for its day, but there were tons and tons of people who had never heard it. I guess especially in the New York City area in the late 1930s. Well, Orson Welles, no relation, the great actor Orson Welles, with his deep, rich, mellifluous voice, who is kicking around doing different acting jobs, in 1938 he decides, what a great idea, we'll take The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, we'll make it into a kind of radio play, we'll pretend that it's real, and we'll broadcast it over the radio on Halloween night 1938. And he came on the air at the beginning of the program, I think it was 7 p.m., and he said, the following is an act of fiction, yada yada, we hope you enjoy it, it's H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. But then, to increase the sense of realism, Orson Welles cut away to what sounded like an orchestra music program. And they played about 5 or 6 minutes of music. And then they cut in with a live report. We've seen lights landing in something coming down in the area of Plainsville, New Jersey. Now we return you to your regularly scheduled program. Back to the music. And then they cut in again. And then they just go over to the special report the way they do on television now. They go over to the special report and they go back and forth to different Army guys on the radio and plane guys with the walkie-talkies. They couldn't possibly do this live in the real world in 1938, but he created such a marvelous image of these special reports coming in. And evidently, hundreds of thousands of people tuned in just a couple minutes late to this so-called music program. They didn't hear the disclaimer about it being just entertainment. And they freaked out. Here come the Martians with their death rays. You see the tripod, the sort of octopus ships that they had. Wells describes those in the story. Army men saying, fire, fire, and then screaming in death. And then there's a great moment where one of the commanders, the general in the background, goes on the radio and says, is there anybody out there? Anyone at all? People in New Jersey and New York are in panic. They're fleeing the city. People are getting killed. There's a couple people who got killed that night because they drove their cars off bridges in their panic to escape what they thought was an actual invasion from Mars. 1938, people were able to still believe that there was life on Mars so advanced that we couldn't resist them. And Orson Welles had to go on the air about 45 minutes or 50 minutes into the program to repeat, people, we've had certain reports of panic. This is just for your entertainment. We hope you enjoy it. He had to kind of go back on the air, but by then people had, dropped their radios and run out of their houses screaming. So the things that people write in these stories can have a real impact on the world. That's probably one of the most famous examples of impact on the world of a sci-fi story. And part of it is because the technology itself, the radio broadcast, was still able to affect people. People were very, very affected by radio broadcasts back in that day. So when you come to your writing project, be careful. Be careful. You might have an idea that makes your parents run screaming out of the house. Or maybe you've already done that to them. I don't know. Let's talk about this story, The Invisible Man. We're about 20 minutes in. The Invisible Man is actually a concept that's been around for a long time. It goes all the way back to, guess what? Plato's Republic, which Wells had read. Remember that quote I gave you at the very beginning? Socrates said, "For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice." Why am I talking about justice? Because in The Invisible Man, you're going to see a fella who believes that the laws don't really apply to him anymore. He has changed. His attitude has changed because he is invisible, right? So this is something that you have to consider when you look at a work like this. It's not just a ripping little romance about science fiction and a scientist running wild, like you see in the later movies too. What's really happening to people as a result of this? So in Plato's Republic, Socrates and his students are all gathered around trying to figure out what justice is. They're trying to define, what is it actually? What is it? And there's always a stooge in the beginning of these dialogues. A guy named Thrasymachus, in this case, steps up and says, well, justice is obviously just the will of the stronger, that's all. There's always somebody who gives you this false idea first that they have to get rid of. But that's a popular idea, Thrasymachus is basically saying, the victors make the history. He says justice is whatever the guys who are in charge say it is. That's all. They pass laws that benefit themselves, and everybody else just has to do what they say. Well, Socrates has a style where he asks you questions and he gets you to give answers, and eventually he leads Thrasymachus into contradicting himself several times, because justice is supposed to be this thing that's good. And if guys were really in charge of society, they could just do whatever they wanted, but why would they call it good? Why would they feel a need to say that it was just instead of just it's my self-interest and I'm in charge and shut up? So Thrasymachus goes off sputtering and angry, and everybody kind of chuckles at him. But one of Socrates' good students, Glaucon, one of his good boys, the little apple polisher, says, Socrates, I think you're right that Thrasymachus had a ridiculous notion, but can't we just take this a little further? He says, isn't it true that justice is often treated as just the fear of punishment? Isn't it true that people behave well, they're honest, they don't steal, they don't murder, because they're afraid of being caught and they would be punished? And he brings up, the student Glaucon, brings up the ancient story, which even in Socrates' day was an ancient story, of the Ring of Gyges. It's all about a shepherd who lived over in what's now Turkey, across from Greece, in the barbarian lands. And this simple shepherd, Gyges, is there minding his flock when there's a big earthquake and the rocks split, and down in this cave, he dares to go down in this cave, and he sees this enormous tomb. And in the tomb is a giant bronze horse, this enormous, bigger-than-life bronze horse, and there's a little panel in the side that opens up, and he looks inside the bronze horse, and there is the dead body of an enormous man, larger than life, a giant. And the only thing on this corpse is this lovely golden ring with a stone on it. So he takes the ring. And he goes back to his fellow shepherds and tells them about his adventures and so forth. And he's just kind of foozling with the ring. It's got a little gem on the top, and he's kind of foozling with the bezel of the ring. And it turns a little bit, and suddenly the other shepherds start discussing him as if he's not there. He's left, and they didn't see him leave. He's become invisible, and he experiments back and forth. He reappears, and then he disappears again. He realizes that he can do this whenever he wants. And Gyges immediately goes to the capital of the kingdom. I think it's Phrygia. He goes to the capital of Phrygia, enters the palace invisibly, seduces the king's wife, and gets her help to murder the king and become king himself. And here come the worst two words in the whole story: the end. That's it. He has an invisible ring. He uses it to go make himself king, to seduce the king's wife, and take over the throne. Full stop. And Glaucon turns to Socrates and says, don't you think a lot of people would do that, would act that way? And Socrates has to admit, okay, you're right, I have to define justice in such a way that it's a good in and of itself, and I'll accept the challenge, he says, that if a just man found such a ring, he actually would never use it. Now I ask you to consider. First of all, you can thank your lucky stars that we're not in class right now, because I'd be bracing you with questions right now. I'd be asking you, do you think you would behave differently if you found a ring of invisibility that always worked and seemed to have no downside whatsoever? You could turn invisible whenever you wanted. Would you behave any differently? Socrates is saying that if you were a just man or woman, you would basically just put the ring in a box and never use it. Oh, really? Really? Let me give you 3 examples. We can't discuss them, but just think about these. Robbing a bank, taking, $12,000 from a bank. Supposing you get away with it completely. Bad, good, who's hurt, who isn't? How about, second example, peeking at another student's test answers, the ones that you know are right, so that you can get 100 on the test instead of, let's say, a 70. If you could do that with the ring, who's hurt, who's not? How about, I don't know, tiptoeing over to the other side's locker room. Boy peeking into the girl's locker room, girl peeking into the boy's locker room. Nobody finds out. Nobody finds out. It's the perfect crime. Is anybody really hurt? Do you think, in cases, all 3 of those cases, that you would not use the ring? What if you needed the money? What if it was just one test, these stupid standardized tests, you're never going to take it again the rest of your life? Who's really going to be hurt? A little peek? This is the kind of question that H.G. Wells is raising with his story. And it seems to me that there was something about a ring that you could use to turn invisible in some other story that we read this year. What ring is this? Eh? It says the ring of Gyges here because they're drawing a relationship to a ring that you didn't wear on your finger. You wore on a necklace around your neck. Why? Because it could turn you invisible. But there was a price to pay, wasn't there, for using this ring? Not so much in the story you read. In The Hobbit, Bilbo finds a ring that turns him invisible. And he uses it several times. In fact, at one point, while the dwarves are all captives of the elves in Mirkwood, he wears it for, I think, 2 solid weeks. And it's nice to know that it doesn't have that much of an effect on him. But as we see in Lord of the Rings, it is dangerous to use a ring like that, right? Because the ring is actually made by the biggest, baddest, evil guy left in the world, Sauron. And if you put it on, number one, he can see you. He can see you better when you put it on, which is, of course, incredibly perilous. And number 2, it seems to bend you to its will, right? Gollum wore this ring for decades and decades, and he's become this horrendous, murderous, backstabbing, raw fish-eating, skeletal, awful creature, right? And Frodo, who has to carry the ring, feels the pull. He feels the tug, all the time. And if you haven't read the end of the book, I won't tell you. But Tolkien seemed to be saying that there's no such thing as no consequences to putting on a ring of invisibility.